kind of quantum computers or whatever. The irrelevance of that is such that we just have to say to people, every one of those models has been completely wrong. We need to think of totally different ways about being able to recognize the human person. And indeed, the fight is really about the person. When Karol Wojtyła was the Archbishop of Krakow, he actually corresponded with all kinds of people. I honestly don't know when the guy slept. But we have his correspondence, and he wrote to Henri de Lubac, the French philosopher, and he said, "I spend my free time, what little I have of it, addressing the fundamental problem of our time, which is the pulverization of the human person." I've always liked that word, the pulverization of the human person, literally the grinding into small pebbles of the human person. And he didn't mean it just in regard to what he was contending against under communism. He meant it in the broad sense, and we certainly saw that, because here was a philosopher and indeed a theologian that saw the broad range of human activity. And as a person who lived through a good part of the 20th century, that century of tears and blood, as he himself said, he knew what he meant. But he was absolutely clear to say it isn't just wars, it isn't just genocide that we have to worry about. It's what's happening within our culture. In 1964, the California Medical Review was very clear when they said if we're going to talk about abortion, we must talk about the killing of the fetus. And we must recognize that this will make a major change in the social view of the human being. That was 1964, and it wasn't exactly from a kind of a journal that you would expect any kind of personalism, but at least they were clear and they were honest. It's the killing of that fetus, it's the killing of something. And it means that it will change how we will look at human beings, and that's true. If you have read Humanae Vitae, and if you Evangelium Vitae, and if you haven't, you really have to. You have to sit down and read it critically, both as a diagnosis but also as a battle plan. The Holy Father brings in all of these threats against human life, but he necessarily zeroes in on those questions such as abortion or euthanasia or the taking of life of the innocent. And so too we have to as well. Not that genocide can ever be justified, nor war or anything else, but within our societies, however those societies take shape within this extremely broad country of ours, within our societies, these are the issues that we can be able to deal with and that we are seeing addressed by our people each and every day. So in that regard then, we need to be able to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be a human person? And it isn't just something that you have to have in your philosophy class. One of the reasons we have a Congress like this is there's no exam at the end of it. The exam is one's whole life and work. It means that we have to be able to really chew that over and pray over it, to say, what does it mean to be a person? And how do I express it as to what it means to be a person? Not just how do I recognize it. It's why we're asking you to look at this range of issues, okay? People have said, well, why do you have internet pornography here? And I said, because that's a denigration of the human person too. That's an objectivization of the human person. Why do we have this aspect or that aspect? Because it ties into what a person is and how a person can be recognized. It's especially germane to our time, for instance, that with the ubiquity of internet and social media, it's incredibly easy to objectivize the person. It's always a little hard to objectivize somebody that you have to interact with on a personal basis. It really is. Not too many of us have servants and all the rest of it, but even servants don't get objectivized too easily because they're persons. If you were intimately involved in slavery, it was really hard to objectivize the person because you got to know him or her. It's awfully easy to do that through images or if we change the vocabularies, as you well know. We're going to hear a lot about that changing of vocabulary. So one is to open ourselves to the range, but the other is to be able to look critically at depth. One of the most difficult problems that I think priests have is to be able to look at things in depth. We're busy, you know, we're busy. You might hear this again, but I think one of the greatest introductions I've ever heard to a talk was Jean-Marie Lustiger, the late Cardinal Archbishop of Paris. When he was in Toronto, he started off his talk And he did so in beautiful French. There's only the Parisian, true Parisian French. And he said this. His voice was very poor at the time, and he was dying of throat cancer. And he said, I was walking down the street, the Champs-Élysées, the other day, and the devil came up behind me and he spoke to me. Do you want to know what he said? And everybody went, yeah. He said, Jean-Marie, get busier. Very interesting, eh? Jean-Marie, get busier. In other words, get busy so you don't have the time, the energy, the ability to be able to look in depth at what you need to do. When John Paul II took over as Archbishop of Krakow, think of the problems that guy had. Poland in the 50s under the grinding heel of totalitarian Stalinism. Think of it. And yet he narrowed it all down to 6 points. 6 things. And I wonder, what was his to-do list when he took over the papacy? But they narrowed it down and they said, this is what you do. And he took the time to seriously reflect in depth on what the issues were in front of him. I can tell you honestly, my friends, as a pastor, it's incredibly busy. Incredibly busy. And I've seen so many good men ground down in the pastorate because there is no end to it. There isn't. And almost all the priests I know feel somewhat guilty, or they make compromises or whatever. They do. Or they run around, as type A's, they run around doing all kinds of things. But what we ask you to do is to take some time so you come in depth on the issues, so that we can reflect in wisdom, in knowledge, in understanding, and in counsel, to really bring those intellectual gifts to bear on the issues in front of us, and to be able to recognize that those gifts are best done in connection with other people. Because if you're busy, you're isolated. Okay? You don't have time to form connections. Yeah, I got to get back and forth. Someday we've got to get together. Yep, sometime we're going to do this, and sometime I say to people, they'll say, sometime we've got to have you over, Father. I said, sometime is never. Isn't that true? Sometime is no time. That's all there is to it. You've got to get out the book, and you've got to be able to say, okay, this is what I'm going to do. Now the difficulty with that is, you're all still students. And you're good students. You may not think so, but you're good students. And therefore, you've really taken into yourself that whole idea, you've internalized that whole idea of students, so that is, I'm going to study something, I'm going to master it, and then when I'm finished, I'm going to do the standard thing and I'm going to put it away in a compartment. I finished that, okay, next. That's not what we're asking you to do. We're asking you to make these kinds of connections so that you can be able to draw upon one another and one another's resources, so that then we can be able to see how it is together we build up that culture. That is what I was mentioning earlier in the first part about integration. To say, well, how do we do it? Sounds great. It sounds great. But isn't one of the great complaints that people have coming out of the seminary is, it isn't practical? And we've been taught this and we've been taught this, but it isn't practical. What I ask you to do is to say, well, that sounds wonderful, but what then must we do? That has been a cardinal rule of my life, that as the people said to John the Baptist when they came up out of the River Jordan after being baptized, what then must we do? Okay? Because we've got to do something. And I think that's incredibly important to remember that. And so if it isn't going to be handed to you, then we have to formulate it. And I'm not very keen on things that are just handed to people. I'm not. I think we have to look at how formulation means that things can be put into action. And one of the things I like to see among younger priests is people will say, well, who do you have coming to speak? And how did that work for you? And how did this work? In the same way, we have to say, okay, what are you aiming for? What are you trying to do in your parish? What are you trying to do, hopefully, in your diocese? But if you're going to